Welcome. Tonight's story is shared in a gentle voice. Take a deep breath, and let's begin. Part 1. My name is Claudia Mercer, and I was married to Gerald for 42 years. We built a life that looked perfect, from the outside brick estate, country club invitations, to well-mannered sons, and a dining room that hosted Thanksgiving every single year. I baked from scratch, wore pearls on Sundays, and kept my voice soft even when I was screaming inside. That's what wives like me were taught to do. Keep the peace. Keep the family together. Keep the secrets. Even when those secrets sit at the head of your table, carving turkey like nothing ever happened. I knew Gerald had a wandering eye. I even forgave him for the rumors back in the 90s. The late work nights. The lipstick on the cuff that he said was from a hug. But nothing prepared me for this. For her. For the fact that 1 week 7 days before we signed our divorce papers, my husband slept with my daughter-in-law. Not just any woman. The one married to my son. The mother of my grandchildren. The woman who called me mom and hugged me tight when she left family dinners. I found out because he left his phone on the garden table. He never did that. I wasn't snooping. I was bringing him his coffee, like I'd done for 40 years. And there it was, her name, her photo, a message that said, "Last night was unforgettable. I can't wait to be yours for real." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply turned, walked back into the kitchen, and poured his coffee down the sink. That was the last time I served him anything. I smiled at breakfast. I signed the papers. I even kissed him on the cheek when the lawyers shook our hands. And then I made the calls. To my accountant, my lawyer, my late father's business partner. You see, Gerald always thought the family estate was his. But my father was a man of details. And when he died, he left me something I never told anyone about. The final controlling stake in the land, beneath Gerald's business, and the original deed to the estate. Not the copy Gerald framed in his office, the real one. I'd kept it in a safety box under my maiden name, with documents that made sure no matter what happened, the last word would be mine. My daughter-in-law moved in with him 3 weeks after the divorce. She redecorated the living room and posted a photo online captioned, "New beginnings with my forever." I didn't comment. I didn't even blink. I waited. Quietly, precisely, until I got a letter from the bank saying their loan renewal was denied. Because the land title had changed hands. Mine. Gerald stormed into my garden that afternoon, demanding answers. I offered him tea, sat calmly, then handed him a copy of the deed with my name on it. He turned pale. She stepped out behind him, wearing one of my silk robes, trying to act like this wasn't about her. But her eyes told the truth. She was terrified, because she knew what I was about to do. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "You should pack. You're trespassing." And I turned away, letting the security team escort them off my property. Gerald always believed I'd never stand up to him because I never had. I played my role so well he forgot I'd ever been anyone else. But I was my father's daughter, before I was Gerald's wife. And my father taught me two things: never show your full hand and always own the land beneath their feet. After they left the house that day, I walked upstairs and changed the locks. I had the documents filed within 24 hours. Every joint account closed. Every asset I could legally reclaim was pulled back under my name. I didn't move fast out of spite. I moved with precision. Because Gerald didn't just betray me with some stranger. He betrayed me with the one person who had looked me in the eye and called me family. She used to ask me how I kept my skin so smooth, what brand of wine I preferred, And whether I had any of my old gowns she could borrow, she tried to become me. And for a while, I let her. I thought maybe she admired me. Maybe she wanted a real mother. But no, she wanted my place, my influence, my husband, my home. And Gerald? He handed it to her like a gift. But he forgot who built that home brick by brick while he was off building his image. He forgot whose name was on the original family trust, who signed the mortgage while he was in court defending a business lawsuit in '87. He forgot the woman who bailed him out when his second company almost tanked in 2004. And I let him forget. I made myself small to keep the family whole. And in return, he brought her into my life and treated her betrayal like an affair of the heart. But I was done being silent. They moved into a downtown condo after I took the estate back. She tried to launch a new interior design brand, inspired by timeless women. I almost laughed. Instead, I sent a quiet letter to the landlord of their new building. Turns out Gerald had used my name as guarantor when applying for the lease. One notarized letter later, their lease was voided. They had to vacate in 14 days. No scandal, no scene, just quiet consequence. I didn't want them on the street, I'm not cruel, but I wanted her to feel something she'd never known. Being unwelcome, where she thought she belonged. At the next family gathering, my son, her husband, now ex, stood on my porch with our grandkids. He looked tired, hollowed out. He didn't ask me what happened. He just said, "Thank you for not letting her destroy everything." I didn't ask what he meant. I just set the table. And this time, I sat at the head. 2 weeks later, I received a handwritten note delivered. Not mailed, folded neatly and tucked into my mailbox with no envelope. It was from her. No name, no greeting, just 4 lines in slanted cursive. I see now what you are. You always knew how to win. But you didn't have to destroy everything. I hope it was worth it. I read it once. Then again. Then I folded it back and placed it inside the drawer where I kept old receipts and broken keys. Things I never used but never threw away. I didn't respond. What could I possibly say to a woman who mistook consequences for cruelty? I didn't destroy anything. I simply stopped protecting people who counted on my silence. I let her fall with the same grace she pretended to show me at family dinners. A week after the note, I found out she'd moved back in with her parents. Gerald was staying in a motel near the freeway. His new business partners pulled out of a land deal when they learned I now controlled the zoning. It wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries. I wasn't punishing them. I was reclaiming the parts of myself I had given away too cheaply. And as the dust settled, I noticed something else. I started laughing again. Not loudly. Not in front of anyone. But real laughter. The kind that bubbles up when the silence in your house finally feels peaceful, not empty. I bought new linens. I replanted the hydrangeas. I replaced the photos on the hallway wall, not out of spite, but because I wanted the house to reflect what remained, not what left. Friends started calling more. Old colleagues invited me to lunches again. I realized I hadn't just lost a marriage, I'd lost years of myself in someone else's story. And now I was rewriting it. The woman who brought me betrayal didn't take anything I wasn't ready to give up. She only revealed what I needed to see. I had let loyalty become a leash, but not anymore. Sometimes I wonder if they ever talk about me if they sit in some small apartment or late night diner and whisper my name like it still holds power over them. Maybe they tell themselves I overreacted, that I couldn't handle being left, that I lashed out because I was bitter and old and alone. Let them think that. Let them rewrite the story if it makes them feel better. But I know the truth. I didn't lose anything worth keeping. I didn't cling to what had already crumbled. I stood still while the storm passed, and when it was over, I swept up the dust and lit a candle in the quiet. I learned how to sit in a room with my own thoughts and not feel hollow. I hosted brunches again, real ones, with laughter and fresh flowers and no obligation to smile through clenched teeth. I wore dresses that didn't hide my age. I spoke in full sentences without asking for permission. And when my grandson looked at me and asked, "Grandma, are you happy now?" I didn't hesitate. I said, "Yes," because I finally came home to myself. He didn't understand the depth of that answer, not yet. But one day he will. One day, when life tests him, when someone tries to take his softness for weakness or his loyalty for silence, he'll remember the woman who rebuilt her life from the inside out. The woman who held the deeds not just to the house, but to her own peace. The woman who never raised her voice, but made herself heard anyway. My name is Claudia Mercer. I was the wife, the hostess, the keeper of the family name. And now I'm simply the woman who remembered she was never just someone's wife. I was the foundation, and I still am. Thanks for watching part 1 of Claudia Mercer's story. When betrayal comes from inside the family, silence can be the sharpest blade. But Claudia isn't done. In part 2, the truth behind her daughter-in-law's ambition begins to surface, and Claudia has one more card to play. Part 2, the house, the canvas, the name. The first time I saw her again after everything unfolded, she was standing in the frozen foods aisle of Baxter's Market, wearing oversized sunglasses like anyone cared enough to recognize her. I didn't approach her. I didn't even slow down. I pushed my cart right past and let the click of my heels echo down the aisle like punctuation. But I caught the way she flinched when she saw me. Good. Let her remember that the woman she tried to erase was still here, well-dressed, unbothered, and in control. It wasn't just about taking back my house or my name, it was about taking back my presence, my breath, my time, my space. For too long I had been the background character to everyone else's ambition. The mother who arranged the dinners, the wife who nodded politely, the hostess who smiled through every insult hidden behind compliments. But no more. I didn't owe anyone anything. And when Gerald filed a motion to regain partial rights to one of the shared properties, we'd held through a blind trust thinking I'd overlook the fine print. I showed up to court in a navy suit and heels, placed a single page of signed authorization from the original trustee in front of the judge, and watched as Gerald's face collapsed into disbelief. It was always mine. He just assumed I'd never notice, or that I'd be too tired to fight. That was the thing they both forgot. I was tired. Yes, but not weak, not blind, not done. And when the judge ruled in my favor and the reporters outside asked if I had anything to say, I simply said, "It's never too late to remember who you are." That clip made it into the local paper. Page 6. Some of the women from my bridge club sent flowers. Others sent handwritten notes saying things they'd never dared admit out loud. One said, "You reminded me I can still start over at 70. That meant more than the ruling, because this wasn't just about winning, it was about waking up, about showing women like me that we don't disappear with age, we become sharper, more precise, more dangerous in the best way." I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted freedom. And every step I took away from the old version of my life felt like peeling off a mask I didn't even know I was wearing. My days became quieter, but richer. I started painting again, just watercolors at first, then oil. Then I signed up for an exhibit small, just local, but the gallery asked if I'd consider a solo showing. I hadn't been asked something like that in decades. Not since before I had kids. Before I became Mrs. Gerald Mercer. It reminded me that Claudia still existed, still dreamed, still created. I hung one of my paintings in the hallway where their wedding portrait used to hang. Not out of bitterness, but because I'd earned that space. Because what I'd made with my own hands mattered more than the lies they whispered behind closed doors. I hadn't just survived their betrayal, I'd outgrown it. It wasn't long before someone knocked on my door again, not Gerald, not her, but someone I hadn't expected at all. Her mother. I recognized her from old photos on the piano. When they first got married, sharp chin, expensive coat. The kind of woman who always kept a tissue in her sleeve and her judgment just behind her eyes. She stood on my porch like she owned it, like the house had once been hers and she was returning to collect what was owed. Claudia, she said, like we were two society wives in the middle of a polite disagreement. I didn't invite her in. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. She glanced at the manicured lawn, the clean steps, the fresh coat of paint on the porch railings. You've kept it beautiful, she said. I stayed silent. She shifted her weight, then said, I wanted to explain what she's been through. You don't know the pressure she was under. That was when I smiled. Not wide. Just enough to let her know I'd heard that sentence before, maybe 100 times. In 100 ways. About husbands. About sons. And now about the woman who tried to climb over me like I was a rung on her ladder. She made her choices, I said calmly. And I made mine. The woman blinked, as if she hadn't expected me to be so still, so composed. She came to intimidate. I let her stand in her discomfort. Before she left, she tried one more time. There's talk, she said. People are starting to say things. About the money. About how you used the trust. About how you humiliated Gerald in court. I nodded slowly. Then replied, let them talk. That's all people like that ever do. And I turned my back on her. Just like I had on every version of myself that once craved their approval. That week I received another invitation, this time from the museum downtown. They wanted to include one of my landscapes in their winter showing. I stood in front of the blank canvas for a long time before I started. I wasn't painting for anyone else now. Not to impress. Not to belong. I was painting what it felt like to breathe again. The painting I submitted was called Inheritance. And it wasn't subtle. A wide open field beneath a shifting sky. A house in the distance with one broken window and one lit from within. I didn't explain it to anyone. I didn't need to. The gallery placed it in the center of the main hall. On opening night, a stream of well-dressed guests circled the room, wine glasses in hand, murmuring about color and emotion and brush technique. I stood off to the side in a charcoal suit and low heels, invisible by choice. Until I saw him, Gerald. He walked in wearing the same tired blazer he wore to our son's graduation. Alone. I wondered who told him about the exhibit. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I watched him walk slowly toward the painting, stop in front of it, tilt his head, the way he always did when pretending to understand art. And then I saw it the moment he realized what he was looking at. That house, that window, that light. His jaw didn't drop. His shoulders didn't slump. He just stood there, frozen in that awful in-between space where regret isn't quite strong enough to become apology. I didn't approach him, but I watched as he turned around, saw me, and tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. I nodded once, then turned my back. I spent the rest of the evening surrounded by women I hadn't seen in years, some old neighbors, a cousin I thought had long since disappeared into someone else's shadow, even the daughter of a woman I once tutored in high school. They all came not because of the painting, but because they'd heard whispers about a woman who walked away from humiliation with her chin raised and her name intact. A woman who didn't scream or slam doors, but who somehow made the walls tremble anyway. One of them asked me how I did it. I said, I stopped mistaking patience for purpose. She blinked like I'd just handed her something she didn't know she needed. I left early. The gallery owner asked if I wanted to stay for the press photos, but I'd already had my moment. I didn't need flashbulbs or headlines. I got into my car, pulled out of the parking lot, and for the first time in years, I drove with the windows down, the wind pulling at my hair, the silence inside my chest replaced by something soft and whole, something that felt like my own name spoken back to me by the life I'd almost forgotten how to want. The next morning I found a letter in my mailbox. Handwritten again, but this time the script was shakier, less sure of itself. It was from Gerald. No return address, just a single sheet folded in thirds. He wrote that he'd seen the painting, that he understood now not just what I'd painted, but what I'd lived. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He just said, I never realized how small I made you feel until I saw how large you really are. I placed the letter in the same drawer where I'd kept her note months ago. Not because I needed it, but because it reminded me that even those who try to diminish you sometimes end up becoming mirrors. That weekend I sat on the back porch with tea in hand and watched the wind move through the trees like music. My oldest granddaughter joined me, barefoot in the grass, and asked if I'd teach her how to paint. I looked at her and saw so much fire, so much clarity, and I realized that all the choices I'd made, every quiet retaliation, every steady reclaiming of space had carved a path not just for me, but for the girls who came after me. I said yes, of course. And when she asked what we'd paint first, I told her, let's start with the sky. It always knows how to hold everything. That night, I lit a single candle in the dining room and left the door open just a crack, not for anyone else to walk through, but as a reminder to myself. The door is mine now. The house is mine. The name is mine. The voice is mine. And every day I wake up, I get to choose how to use it. That, more than anything they tried to take, is the inheritance I never gave away. Thanks for watching part 2 of Claudia Mercer's story. When dignity becomes your quietest weapon, even silence echoes. But Claudia isn't finished yet. In part 3, someone unexpected re-enters her life, and she's no longer the woman they remember. Part 3. The guest who shouldn't have knocked. It was late autumn when the knock came, not urgent, not timid, just deliberate enough to rattle something old in my spine. I was trimming the dead branches from the roses by the front path, wearing gloves so worn they'd molded to my fingers. When I heard it, I almost didn't answer. Most people called now, texted, sent cards. But this knock felt like a return. I opened the door slowly, expecting maybe a neighbor. Maybe one of those charity volunteers who always pretended we'd spoken before. But it was her, standing there like a misplaced ghost. My former daughter-in-law. No lipstick, no earrings, no weaponized smile. Just tired eyes and a scarf looped once around her neck, like she'd dressed in a rush. I didn't move. She didn't speak right away. Then, with a breath too shaky for someone her age, she said, I didn't know where else to go. I let the silence stretch between us until it frayed. Then I stepped aside, just enough. not an invitation, a permission. She entered slowly, glancing at the same furniture she once dismissed as dated, the same art she once called heavy. I didn't ask why she was here. I went to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of tea, placed them on the table between us, and sat. She looked thinner, or maybe just deflated. I know what I did, she started, and I'm not here to make excuses. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She took that as permission to continue. He left me, she said. After everything, he said I was never really what he wanted. That I reminded him too much of what he'd lost. I sipped my tea. It tasted like cinnamon and steel. You thought you were winning, I said, not as an accusation, but as a diagnosis. She nodded, eyes glossy. He promised me a life. I thought if I just became what he needed. You erased yourself, I finished. And for what? She looked down at her hands, fingers twitching with regret or withdrawal. I couldn't tell which. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she whispered. I just wanted you to know. I see it now. Everything you held, everything you carried. For the first time in years, I saw her not as the girl who shattered my home, but as the woman left standing in its ruins, holding dust in both hands and calling it a future. I didn't cry. I didn't comfort. But I didn't send her away, either. Because sometimes revenge isn't about slamming the door. It's about showing them what grace looks like after they've forgotten its name. She stayed longer than I expected. Not hours, but enough minutes to make the air shift. To turn my home into something heavier again. She wandered to the bookshelf like she used to, though this time without the casual mockery she once carried like perfume. Her fingers paused over a spine, the collection of letters my mother had written during the war, bound in worn leather. She glanced at me, as if seeking permission, and I gave a barely perceptible nod. I watched her read in silence, and it was strange. The woman who once took so much from me now sitting with irreverence I never thought her capable of. I used to think strength meant being wanted, she said, not looking up. Now I think it might mean knowing how to be alone. I didn't respond. I simply got up, walked to the cupboard, and pulled out the letter she once left me, the one that started it all. I placed it on the table between us like a relic or maybe a warning. Do you want it back? I asked. She looked down at it, her eyes wide, then slowly shook her head. That version of me, she said, swallowing. I don't think she deserves to be remembered. I picked up the letter, held it for a breath, then tossed it into the fire. No ceremony, no rage. Just paper turning black at the edges, curling inward like a lie finally retreating. She startled slightly, then watched the flames with a kind of awe. Why did you do that? She asked quietly. Because I'm done letting the past draft my future, I said. And because you don't get to carry it either. She sat very still after that, like a statue trying to understand its own weight. Eventually, she stood. If I write to you, she said, voice brittle, will you read it? I considered the question, not as a promise, but as a choice I could revisit. Maybe, I said. But if you write it, make sure it's the truth this time, not the version that suits you. She nodded. Then, before she reached the door, she turned back and added, your son misses you. He's just too much like him to say it. I didn't blink. Then he knows where the door is. The days after her visit felt strangely quieter, not because the house had changed, but because something in me had, like a door had finally been shut and locked from the inside. I went back to my routines. Morning tea in the garden, crossword puzzles in ink, piano keys under my fingers late at night when the world outside fell silent. But I noticed how I started leaving the front porch light on again. Not out of hope, but habit. One afternoon I received a package in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, untouched, and on the first page in small block letters, "For when you're ready to tell your version." No note, no signature, just that. I didn't need a name. I placed the journal on my writing desk, closed it, and left it there. I wasn't ready, not yet, but the idea of telling it all in my own words stirred something in my bones I hadn't felt in years. Then came the call. My son. I hadn't heard his voice since the final court hearing, the one where he stood beside her and wouldn't meet my eyes. Now his voice was unsure, almost adolescent. He said, "Mom," like he wasn't sure if I'd still claim him. I didn't speak. I let him sit in that silence the way I had for years. Then he exhaled. "I saw her," he said. "She told me about the fire, about what you said. I didn't know you'd kept her letter all this time." I closed my eyes. "What difference would it have made?" I asked. "You chose her." "I chose the version of her I thought I could fix," he said, almost like a confession. "And when I realized I couldn't, I didn't know how to come back." My fingers tightened around the phone. "You come back by showing up," I said, "and by not expecting applause when you do." He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if he could visit. I said no, not yet. And it wasn't out of cruelty. It was because I'd learned that healing has boundaries, and mine were finally starting to hold. Of course, he didn't knock. I heard the car engine cut out just past the gate, then the gravel shifting under hurried feet. My heart didn't race, not the way it used to when he came home late and smelled like lies. I simply reached for the crystal glass beside me, took a sip, and waited. The doorbell rang once, twice, then silence. I waited longer. I wanted him to feel it, the weight of that silence, the absence of immediate forgiveness. When I finally opened the door, he stood there, disheveled, eyes darting behind me like he still had a place here. "Claudia," he said, and I almost laughed. That voice used to unravel me. Now it just sounded empty. "You look good," he added, like that was his entry pass. I didn't invite him in. I stood firm. "Is she with you?" I asked. He flinched. "No," he muttered. "We're not together anymore." I raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" "She get tired of pretending to like the smell of cigars and guilt." He sighed, looked older than he ever did when we were married. "It wasn't real," he said. "She wanted what she could take, not what she could build." I tilted my head. "And what exactly do you think she took?" His mouth opened, then shut. He looked around the porch like the right answer might be hidden in a flower pot. "I don't know," he admitted. "Time? Trust? Mine or yours?" I asked. He didn't answer. That was the thing about cheaters. They were always so surprised when the door they burned didn't reopen. I came to apologize. He finally said, and maybe, I interrupted. "You thought I'd forgotten the anniversary of the day you ruined your family for a thrill." He looked like he'd been slapped. I didn't enjoy it. Not fully, but I didn't regret it either. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out an envelope. "It's the deed," he said, "to the lake house. I'm signing it over to you. I shouldn't have fought for it. It was always yours." I took it, glanced at the signature, then folded it slowly and tucked it inside my sleeve like a magician hiding her last trick. "Thank you," I said. Not because I forgave him, but because the gesture had finally arrived a decade too late. He turned to leave, but paused. Do you ever think we could have made it? I didn't answer. I let the question hang in the air like cigar smoke. Some things didn't deserve clarity. He left, and this time I didn't watch the car drive away. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down with the deed in my lap. I ran my fingers over the paper. Cold, final, legal. I wasn't happy, but I was free. And sometimes freedom doesn't look like joy. It looks like quiet mornings where you can hear yourself think, and nights where the bed feels like your own again. I stood, walked to the fireplace, and placed the deed in the drawer beneath the old clock he gave me when we still said I love you and meant it. I didn't throw it away. I didn't burn it. I let it live in the silence, in the drawer of things that once mattered but no longer held weight. My son called again that evening. This time, I answered. He said he'd been thinking a lot about growing up, about what he missed. He asked if I'd ever consider coming to see his daughter. She's named after you, he said softly. I couldn't speak. Not right away. Grief and grace sometimes speak the same language, and I wasn't fluent in either just yet. But I said yes, and when I hung up, I walked to the mirror, the one that had reflected every stage of my becoming. Wife, mother, widow of a marriage, woman again. Thanks for watching part 3 of Claudia Mercer's journey. Sometimes, the people who leave take less than we feared, and leave behind more than we expected. But Claudia's not done writing her story. In part 4, a door she thought was closed forever creaks open, and what steps through might just change everything. Part 4, the letter, the visit, the goodbye. He wasn't supposed to come alone. I'd already set out to extra cups. One for him, one for her. Maybe that was my mistake, assuming they still moved as a unit. But when the car pulled in and only my son stepped out, hands in pockets, eyes uncertain, I knew something had shifted. I didn't rush to the door. I let him knock. Twice. Just like his father. When I opened it, I smiled. Not out of habit, but because he looked like the boy who used to sit at the edge of my bed and ask why the moon followed our car home. He stepped inside, quieter than usual, and handed me a thick envelope. She left, he said simply. Took the baby, took everything. I didn't flinch. I only asked, when? He sat at the table, ran his hands through hair that was more gray than I remembered. A week ago, said she needed space. Then her lawyer called. I poured the tea. I didn't ask what kind of space she needed. I had a feeling it was shaped like an inheritance she thought she'd earned. He looked up at me with that boyish pain men carry into adulthood when they've never seen women held properly. Was it always this hard? He asked. I slid the sugar toward him. No, I said. Sometimes it's worse. The letter he'd given me sat on the table between us. I hadn't opened it. Not yet. Because I knew her handwriting, and I knew better than to trust the curve of AG. Did she say why? I asked. He laughed. Bitter, short. She said I reminded her too much of you. I blinked. And that's a bad thing. To her, apparently. He shrugged. She said I wait too long before speaking. That I watch people too closely. That I make her feel like she's being measured. I sipped my tea. You were never measuring her. You were looking for the part of her that wouldn't leave. You just never found it. He didn't cry. Not fully. But he looked like someone who'd run out of places to hold it in. I reached for his hand. For a moment, we just sat like that. Not mother and son. Not betrayed and betrayed again. but just to people who knew what it felt like to be left behind by someone who called it self-care. I finally opened the letter. The handwriting was graceful. The words weren't. It wasn't an apology. It was a transaction, a list of what she believed she was owed, peppered with passive phrases like "after all I've endured and given, the circumstances." I folded it, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it beside the teacups. "You don't have to respond," I said. "Let the silence be your answer." He looked at me then. Really looked. "How did you do it?" he asked. "Survive all of this?" I stood, walked to the window where light spilled across the floor in a shape that looked like something holy. "I didn't survive," I said quietly. "I changed shape. I became someone they couldn't recognize anymore, someone they couldn't use." He rose, pulled me into a hug that felt like it belonged to a decade we both skipped. "I want her to see the baby," he whispered. "One day. But not now." "One day," I agreed. "When you choose it, not when she demands it." He nodded. Then, before leaving, he said something that melted everything I'd braced myself to carry. "Mom, I named her Claudia because I wanted her to grow up knowing what strength looked like in silence." I couldn't speak. I just watched him go, the door closing softly behind him. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence felt full, not of pain, but of peace. He drove away slow, like he wasn't ready to leave but knew he had to. And I stood at the window long after the car disappeared behind the hedges, my hand resting gently on the pane like I was holding the moment still. The quiet afterward wasn't heavy. It was cleansing, like the air that follows a summer storm. I turned back to the table, picked up the envelope again, and held it over the sink. For a moment, I considered lighting it, but no, fire leaves ash, and I didn't want even that of her in this house. So I tore it instead, piece by piece, slow, careful, until it was nothing but unreadable scraps floating down into the bin. I rinsed the teacups, let the hot water run longer than necessary, and looked out the kitchen window at the garden I hadn't touched in months. The roses were wild now, unpruned, but blooming defiantly in every direction like they didn't care who admired them. I made a note to trim them tomorrow, maybe replant something new, something that grows best in clean earth. That afternoon I took the painting down, the one over the fireplace. It had hung there for decades, chosen by him because it matched the tones in the rug. I wrapped it in a blanket, set it by the front door, and called the local gallery. "Donation," I told them. "No, I don't need a receipt. I just want it gone." When they asked for the artist's name, I smiled. "My ex-husband," I said. "It's time his art belonged to someone else." They didn't ask questions. They came that evening, polite and quiet, and I handed them the painting with both hands. Not out of reverence, but out of finality. The space above the fireplace looked empty, but in the most honest way, like a wall that had finally stopped lying. I didn't rush to fill it. Some spaces are meant to breathe before they hold anything new. I spent the rest of the day walking the perimeter of the property, tracing the edges of what was mine again, not out of greed, but to remind myself that every tree, every cracked stone in the path, every wind chime and creaky gate belonged to someone who hadn't been afraid to stay. I slept with the window open that night, not because the air was warm. It wasn't, but because I no longer feared what might drift in. Let the night have its whispers. I had nothing left to hide. The next morning I brewed coffee in my quiet kitchen and didn't check my phone, not out of discipline but because for the first time in years, There was no one I owed an answer to. The silence didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like ownership. I sat at the sunlit table in my silk robe, the one I had stored away for special mornings I never allowed myself to have, and let the hours pass without urgency. Around noon, I opened the drawer in my study where the old journals were kept. Some pages were frayed, others still smelled of ink and perfume. Little reminders of who I used to be before life hardened the edges. I flipped through entries written in my 20s, 30s, even a note from the night my first grandchild was born. And I noticed how my handwriting changed over time. More rigid, more compressed, as though I had been shrinking on paper too. But in one journal, pressed between two pages, I found the small photograph I had once hidden from everyone. It was taken on a trip to Barcelona, decades ago. In it, I was laughing with a stranger who never knew my name. It was just one night, one dance, 1 hour of boldness I'd buried under a lifetime of obedience. I held it in my hand and smiled, not with regret, but with recognition. She was still in there, that girl. She hadn't died beneath the decades. She had just learned to wait. That evening, I walked through town in a deep green dress I hadn't worn since my anniversary dinner 13 years ago. I wore it for me this time. No jewelry, no heels, just flats and a scarf tied at the neck. I passed the bistro where I knew Gerald liked to take her, the new her who replaced me, barely older than my youngest granddaughter. I didn't stop. I didn't glance through the window. I didn't need to, because I already knew how it ended, not in rage or courtroom victories, but in quiet dinners alone, where the conversation dies before the second glass of wine. I went, instead, to the gallery, the one that took his painting. They'd hung it near the back, beside a piece from an emerging artist in her 30s, vibrant, strange, unapologetic. The contrast was striking. His work looked tired, predictable, framed control. I stared for a moment, then turned toward the bold color beside it, letting my eyes soak in the chaos. "Would you like to meet the artist?" the curator asked, gently. I nodded. She arrived 10 minutes later, all denim and paint on her hands. We spoke for an hour, about art, about aging, about starting over when the world insists your best years are behind you. I left with a small canvas under my arm and a card in my coat pocket. "You have the eyes of someone who's seen too much and still wants more," she'd said, and I carried those words home like a keepsake. That night, as the last of the autumn leaves scattered across the courtyard, and the wind pressed gently against the old stained glass windows, I sat in the parlor and lit a single candle, not for ceremony, but for closure. The house no longer smelled like him, his aftershave, his leather chair, the brandy he used to sip like a ritual. All of it had been scrubbed, replaced, reimagined. In their place, lavender, polish, and the faintest trace of turpentine from the easel I'd finally dared to set up by the sunroom. I wasn't trying to recreate the past or rewrite it. No, I was simply claiming the silence he'd never let me have. The gallery had sent word earlier that week. Gerald's painting had sold, but not for much. A quiet, almost pitiful price, tucked low on the invoice. I didn't flinch. The real story was in the letter clipped beside it. A critic's note about how dated the style felt, how it ached for the validation of the past but offered little to the present. That same week, a collector had reached out to the young woman I met, the artist who spoke in colors. Her piece had sold too, for triple the price. When she called to tell me, she laughed. "We're not supposed to win, you know," she said. "Not women like us." Not after 60. I told her she was wrong. Women like us don't just win. We redefine what the finish line looks like. And then I poured myself a glass of red, opened the tall windows, and watched the night fall without dread. What Claudia did in the end wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet power, carefully measured. When betrayal strikes close, dignity becomes the sharpest response. Thank you for watching this chapter. The next story might just surprise you more than this one. She was dismissed, deceived, nearly erased. But Claudia Mercer never needed revenge to look ugly. She made it graceful. And in doing so, she reminded all of us, some people don't deserve a fight, just your absence. Thank you for staying with her until the end. Another story begins soon.